They thought an old man was bluffing, until the fence bit back. The first time the HOA patrol crossed the line, it didn't feel real. We lived in the house for 8 quiet years, long before the neighborhood revitalization committee turned into a full-blown homeowners association with badges, clipboards, and self-importance. Our property sat at the edge of the subdivision, bordered by open fields and an old wooden fence that Grandpa had reinforced himself. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't trendy, but it was solid, legal, and very clearly marked the boundary between public and ours. Apparently, that line meant nothing to them. It started with small things. A folded warning letter taped to our mailbox claiming our gate aesthetic didn't align with community standards. Then came printed photos, close-ups of our shed, our truck, even the back porch furniture taken from angles that could only be possible if someone had stepped onto our land. Grandpa brushed it off at first. It probably leaned over. He muttered, sipping his coffee, but I could see the crease forming between his eyebrows. One Tuesday morning, I caught them in the act. I was working from home when I noticed movement outside the kitchen window. 2 men in matching polo shirts with the HOA logo stitched over the chest were standing inside our yard. Inside, one of them was holding a tablet, zooming in on the side of our barn. The other was taking pictures of the fence itself, like it had personally offended him. They hadn't knocked. They hadn't called. They had simply climbed over the side panel near the tree line where the wood dipped slightly lower than the rest. For a second, I just stared, thinking maybe I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. Maybe they were chasing a dog. Maybe there was some emergency. But no one of them pointed toward Grandpa's tractor and laughed. I stepped out onto the porch and asked, as calmly as I could, what they thought they were doing. The taller one didn't even look embarrassed. He adjusted his sunglasses and said they were conducting a routine compliance inspection. Routine compliance. As if that explained why they were standing 10 feet from our back door without permission. When I told them they were trespassing, the shorter one actually smirked and said, HOA bylaws allow reasonable inspection of properties to maintain neighborhood standards. Reasonable inspection did not mean vaulting a private fence like it was an obstacle course. Grandpa came out then, slow but steady, leaning on his cane. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply asked them who gave them authority to set foot past that fence. The tall one repeated the same scripted line about standards and community value. He even had the nerve to suggest our fence height might be non-compliant, which was ironic considering they just used it as a ladder. What bothered me most wasn't just the intrusion, it was the entitlement. The way they stood there like they were doing us a favor. The way they acted as if owning a home in the same zip code gave them shared custody of our land. They took a few more photos before finally climbing back over, leaving faint boot marks in the mud near the base of the fence. That afternoon, another notice appeared in our email. This one cited unapproved modifications and visual inconsistencies visible from adjacent properties. Adjacent properties didn't have a view of our backyard. The only way to see what they described was to physically enter it. That was the moment it became clear this wasn't about standards. It was about control. They had crossed a physical boundary. Yes, but more than that. They had crossed a line of respect. Our fence wasn't just wood and nails. It represented privacy, ownership, and the understanding that your neighbor's authority stops where your property begins. The HOA patrol might have believed they were enforcing order. But as they climbed that fence without permission, they proved something else entirely. They didn't see our home as ours. And that was the first mistake they would come to regret. Karen didn't storm onto our property the first time. No, she made an entrance. 2 days after the patrol's little fence climbing adventure. A white SUV with a giant HOA decal on the side rolled slowly down our gravel driveway like it was inspecting a crime scene. It stopped right in front of the porch. The engine stayed running, and after a deliberate pause just long enough to make sure we were watching, the driver's door opened. Out stepped Karen. Perfectly pressed blazer, oversized sunglasses, clipboard tucked against her chest like it was a badge of authority. She didn't look around in confusion or hesitation. She looked around like a landlord checking on tenants who hadn't paid rent. Grandpa was already on the porch in his rocking chair, coffee in hand. He didn't get up. He didn't need to. Karen walked up to the gate and rattled it once, testing it, as if expecting it to magically swing open for her. When it didn't, she cleared her throat loudly and called out, "Hello? HOA inspection. Not. Good morning. Not. May I speak with you? Just a declaration." I stepped outside and asked what she wanted. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind that says, "I am about to tell you what you're doing wrong. We've received multiple reports regarding non-compliant structures and visual violations on your property." She began, flipping a page on her clipboard even though she clearly had rehearsed the speech. Specifically, your perimeter fence, secondary outbuilding, and gate installation. Grandpa raised an eyebrow. "That fence has been there longer than this HOA," he said calmly. Karen gave a tight little laugh. "That may be true, sir, but once the association was formed, all properties became subject to updated community standards. It asked for neighborhood consistency. Neighborhood consistency." She said it like it was sacred law. I asked her why her patrol had been inside our yard without permission. She didn't flinch. "Our compliance officers are authorized to conduct visual inspections where necessary," she replied smoothly. "If certain elements are obstructed from street view, we are permitted to verify conditions by climbing fences." I shot back. She adjusted her sunglasses and shrugged slightly. "If access is reasonably required." That was the moment it became clear Karen genuinely believed she was justified. In her mind, this wasn't trespassing. It was duty. She pointed toward our gate and said it didn't match the approved aesthetic guidelines adopted by the board last year. It was too rustic, too industrial. The hinges were visible. The wood stain wasn't on the official color chart. She even mentioned that Grandpa's tractor, partially visible from one angle at sunset, disrupted the visual harmony of the community. Visual harmony. Grandpa finally stood up, leaning on his cane, and walked slowly down the porch steps. He stopped just inside the gate, facing her through the bars. "You don't get to rewrite history and call it harmony," he said evenly. "We bought this land. We pay our taxes, and nobody steps inside that fence without permission." Karen's smile faded slightly, but only slightly. "Sir, with all due respect, when you purchased property within this subdivision, you agreed to abide by HOA governance. These standards protect everyone's property values." There it was. Property values. The HOA's favorite threat disguised as a favor. She went on to explain that failure to comply could result in escalating fines, liens, and possible legal action. The words rolled off her tongue effortlessly, like she enjoyed saying them. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't emotional. That almost made it worse. It was calm, calculated pressure. I asked her directly if she planned to keep sending people over our fence. She tilted her head slightly and said, "We will continue to enforce community standards as necessary." Not an apology, just a promise. Before leaving, she tapped the gate lightly with her pen and said, "I suggest you review the updated guidelines. We'll be conducting follow-up inspections soon." Then she turned, walked back to her SUV, and drove off slowly again, making sure we were watching. Grandpa stood there for a long moment after she left, staring at the fence like it had personally betrayed him by not keeping arrogance out. "It asked never about the fence," he muttered quietly. "It asked about control." Karen hadn't just come to talk about wood stain and hinges. She came to establish dominance, to make it clear that in her version of the neighborhood, privacy was optional but compliance was mandatory. And that was when we realized this wasn't going to be a simple disagreement. It was going to be a battle of boundaries. Grandpa didn't believe in shouting matches. He believed in warnings. After Karen's performance at the gate and the patrol's not-so-subtle trespassing, something shifted in him. He didn't ran about it. He didn't storm down to the HOA office. He simply watched. From the porch, from the barn, from behind the curtains in the early morning when the subdivision was still quiet. He'd grown up on land where boundaries meant survival. Fence lines weren't decorative suggestions. They were agreements. You respected them, or you dealt with consequences. The HOA, however, treated them like inconveniences. 3 days after Karen's visit, we saw the white HOA pickup crawling down the far edge of our property again. It didn't stop at the street this time. It slowed near the same dip in the fence panel where the patrol had climbed before. The engine idled for a moment, then cut off. Grandpa didn't move from his rocking chair. 2 men stepped out. Same polos, same tablets. One of them glanced toward the house, probably checking if anyone was watching. They thought the porch glare hid Grandpa's eyes. It didn't. They approached the fence and, without knocking or calling out, the shorter one placed his boot on the lower beam and hoisted himself up like he was hopping into his own backyard. The taller one followed. That's when Grandpa finally stood. He didn't rush. He didn't yell. He walked down the porch steps at the same steady pace he always used, cane tapping softly against the wood. The patrol didn't notice him until he was halfway across the yard. "Morning," he called out, voice calm but firm. They both froze mid-step. The taller one forced a smile. "Routine inspection, sir." Grandpa stopped about 15 feet away from them, close enough to make a point, far enough to show he wasn't threatened. "You were told not to cross that fence again," he said evenly. The shorter one shifted uncomfortably but tried to recover. "As we explained before, HOA bylaws permit reasonable access for compliance verification." Grandpa studied them for a long moment. Not angry, not flustered, just measuring. "Let me explain something," he said quietly. "That fence marks private property. You climb it again without permission, and you like what happens next." They actually laughed. Not loudly but enough. The taller one exchanged a glance with his partner and said, "Sir, are you threatening HOA officials?" Grandpa's expression didn't change. "I am warning trespassers." There was a difference, and he knew it. They tried to argue semantics, talking about community standards and shared responsibility. They quoted sections of bylaws like rehearsed lines from a play. Grandpa let them finish. Then he tapped his cane once against the ground. "Boys," he said calmly, "you're reconfusing paperwork with authority." The silence that followed felt heavier than any shouting match could have been. They eventually climbed back over the fence, muttering something about documenting hostile behavior, before getting into their truck. The taller one pointed toward the gate and said, "We'll be back. And next time, we'll have legal backing." Grandpa nodded slowly. "You do that." When the truck disappeared down the road, I asked him what he meant by, "You like what happens next." He didn't answer right away. He walked to the fence panel they used, ran his hand along the wood, and examined the scuff marks from their boots. "They think I am bluffing," he said finally. There wasn't anger in his voice. There was disappointment, like a teacher watching students ignore an obvious lesson. That evening, he made a few phone calls. Not to the HOA, not to neighbors, to the county office, to an old friend who ran livestock fencing across rural properties. He spent an hour reviewing local trespassing statutes and property rights. He even printed out a copy of the HOA bylaws and highlighted sections about board authority limits. Grandpa didn't make empty threats. The next morning, he installed new signage along the fence line. "Private property. No trespassing. Clear. Visible. Legally worded." And when I asked him again what would happen if they crossed it one more time, he gave a small, almost amused smile. "Sometimes," he said, settling back into his rocking chair, "the only way to teach respect is to let someone learn it the hard way." The HOA patrol thought they laughed off an old man's warning. They had no idea they just ignored their last one. Grandpa didn't rush into anything reckless. If the HOA expected some dramatic retaliation, they would have been disappointed at least at first. What he did next was slow, deliberate, and most importantly, legal. He started by confirming exactly what was allowed under county regulations. Rural properties like ours were permitted to use low-voltage electric fencing for livestock containment, as long as it met safety guidelines and was clearly marked. The current had to be non-lethal, posted, and accompanied by warning signage. It wasn't meant to injure. It was meant to discourage. Grandpa didn't own cattle anymore. But the old barn and field zoning still qualified the property as agricultural adjacent. He knew that. And he knew the HOA couldn't override county law. 2 days after the patrol ignored his warning, he installed the system. It wasn't flashy. A thin electrified wire was carefully mounted along the interior frame of the gate and reinforced along the fence section they kept using as a ladder. Bright yellow warning signs were placed at eye level. Electric fence. Do not touch. Private property. The voltage was mild, strong enough to deliver a sharp jolt. Not strong enough to cause injury. Completely compliant. When he finished, he tested it once with a gloved hand and nodded to himself. Teaches faster than paperwork, he muttered. Then he waited. Sunrise came quietly 3 mornings later. The sky was barely orange when we heard the faint rumble of an engine creeping down the side road. Grandpa was already on the porch, rocking gently. Coffee steaming in his hand. Like this was just another peaceful day. The white HOA pickup rolled into view and stopped near the now familiar fence dip. "They're early," I whispered. Grandpa didn't look surprised. People who think they right always show up confident. 2 figures stepped out. Same polos. Same tablets. The taller one scanned the porch. Grandpa didn't wave. He just rocked. They approached the fence casually. Almost bored. The shorter one nudged the same panel with his boot. Testing it. No reaction. He glanced back at his partner with a smirk and began climbing. The moment his hand wrapped around the top rail where the electrified line was discreetly secured, everything changed. There was a sharp snap. Not loud, but distinct. The kind of sound that makes your body react before your brain catches up. He yelped. Not a dramatic scream. More of a shocked grunt mixed with surprise as he jerked backward, losing balance and stumbling into the dirt. His tablet flew from his hand and landed face down in the grass. The taller one stared for half a second, confused, then reached instinctively to steady the fence. Another snap. He recoiled instantly, swearing under his breath, shaking his hand like he grabbed a live wire, which technically he had. From the porch, Grandpa took a slow sip of coffee. "Sign us right there," he called calmly, gesturing toward the bright yellow warning posted at eye level. Both men looked up at the fence, finally noticing what they ignored. "Electric fence. You can do this," the shorter one snapped, rubbing his palm. Grandpa's rocking chair creaked softly as he leaned back. "County says I can." They stared at him, stunned, not injured, not burned, just embarrassed. The jolt had done exactly what it was meant to do. Deliver a lesson without causing harm. The taller one pulled out his phone, likely to call Karen. His voice rose in frustration as he explained what had happened. From the porch, we could faintly hear phrases like unsafe conditions and intentional hazard. Grandpa didn't move, didn't argue, didn't gloat. When the call ended, they gathered the dropped tablet, avoiding the fence entirely this time, and retreated to the truck. As they drove off, Grandpa set his empty cup down on the porch railing. They were warned, he said simply. The electric line hadn't been revenge. It hadn't been anger. It was a boundary made visible in a way they couldn't ignore. And as the morning sun climbed higher, lighting up the bright yellow warning signs they previously overlooked, one thing became very clear. The HOA patrol had just learned that fences aren't suggestions. They relines. Grandpa didn't celebrate. When the HOA truck disappeared down the road after the electrified surprise, he simply adjusted his hat, poured himself another cup of coffee, and settled back into his rocking chair like the morning had gone exactly as expected. There was no grin, no triumphant speech, just patience. The real fallout didn't begin until that afternoon. Around noon, a black SUV pulled up fast, much faster than Karen's usual slow, dramatic entrance. The driver's door flew open before the engine even fully shut off. Karen stepped out. No sunglasses this time. Clipboard clutched tight against her chest like a shield. She didn't stop at the gate. She marched straight up to it, then halted abruptly when she saw the bright yellow warning signs posted clearly across the entrance and fence line. Electric fence. Private property. Do not touch. Her jaw tightened. Grandpa was already on the porch, rocking gently. Watching the performance unfold, I stood near the doorway, arms folded. This is completely unacceptable. Karen called out sharply. You intentionally created a hazardous condition. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. It's a livestock-rated fence, fully compliant with county code. You shocked my compliance officers. She snapped. They shocked themselves. He replied calmly. Climbing a posted fence tends to do that. Her face flushed red. She flipped through papers on her clipboard, clearly searching for anything that would restore her control. HOA bylaws prohibit dangerous installations that interfere with community operations. Grandpa leaned forward slightly in his chair. HOA bylaws don't override county property rights. Silence. That was the first time she didn't have an immediate response. Instead, she pivoted. We were conducting a lawful inspection. You were trespassing. Grandpa corrected evenly. Twice warned. Signs posted. Documentation filed. That caught her off guard. Documentation. Grandpa nodded toward the small security camera mounted discreetly under the porch roof. Video has been saved, along with copies of the notices and timestamps of every unannounced entry. Karen glanced at the camera, then back at the fence, then back at Grandpa. The confidence she'd worn like armor was starting to crack. You're re-escalating this unnecessarily, she said, but her tone had shifted. Less commanding, more cautious. No, Grandpa replied. You escalated it when you stepped over a boundary that wasn't yours. For a long moment, no one spoke. A light breeze moved through the yard, rustling the trees behind the barn. The electric fence emitted its faint, steady pulse barely audible, but present. Then another vehicle pulled up behind Karen's SUV. This one wasn't marked HOA. Two uniformed county deputies stepped out. Karen's head turned sharply. What is this? She demanded. Grandpa stood slowly, leaning on his cane, and walked to the gate, staying safely inside the boundary. I called after the second trespass, he said calmly. Figured it was best to clarify things officially. The deputies approached, professional and neutral. Grandpa handed them printed copies of the county code regarding agricultural fencing and trespassing statutes. He also showed them still images from the security footage, clear shots of the patrol climbing the fence despite visible warning signs. Karen tried to interject, insisting they had authority under HOA governance. But one of the deputies held up a hand gently. Ma'am, he said. HOA authority doesn't extend past private property lines without consent, especially when signage is posted. The shift was subtle but undeniable. For the first time since this all began, Karen wasn't dictating the conversation. She was defending herself in it. The deputies explained that any further entry without permission could result in formal trespassing charges. They advised that disputes over compliance should be handled through official notices and court channels, not physical intrusion. Karen's posture stiffened. She nodded tightly, clearly unhappy but unable to argue. As the deputies returned to their vehicle, she lingered at the gate for a moment, staring at Grandpa through the bars. There was frustration in her eyes, but also something else. Realization. You've made your point, she said finally. Grandpa resumed his seat on the porch, rocking gently once more. I was just protecting mine. Karen turned without another word and walked back to her SUV. This time, she didn't drive slowly. She didn't try to make a statement. She left quietly. In the weeks that followed, the warning letters stopped. The patrol truck never crept along our fence again. Any communication from the HOA came through certified mail and remained strictly on paper. Grandpa kept the electric line active not out of spite, but as a reminder. From the porch, coffee in hand, he would sometimes glance toward the gate and give a small nod to himself. Not because he had won, but because the boundary had finally been respected. And in a neighborhood obsessed with control, that was the real victory. If you love HOA karma stories like this, hit subscribe right now.